Thank you so much for joining us today for our online service. Roger is away this weekend enjoying some very well-earned time to rest and recuperate from the hard work that he's been doing for all these months during the pandemic. So thank you for joining us, and we hope that you'll stick around as we work again to determine and demonstrate and embody what it means to not stand idly by during these difficult times. Thank you.
This is Southern Man by Neil Young. Southern man, better keep your head. Don't forget what your good book said. Southern change gonna come at last. Now your crosses are burning fast, Southern man. I saw cotton, I saw black, tall white mansions and little shacks. Southern man, when will you pay them back? I heard screaming, bullets cracking. How long, how long, how long will it last? Southern man, better keep your head. Don't forget what your good book said. Southern change gonna come at last. Now your crosses are burning fast, oh, Southern man. Lily Bell, hair is golden brown. I've seen your black man coming around. Swear by God I'm gonna cut him down. I heard screaming, bullets cracking. How long, how long, how long will it last? Southern man.
Please join me in reading our meditation. For so long, our nation has hidden violence and injustice behind the lies of economic necessity. We lament that our lives have been shaped by such cruelty and greed, fueled by racism, sexism, and more. And we lament that we have been trained to tolerate and even protect it. As we mourn the untold suffering of countless human lives made disposable on the altar of profit, we condemn these systems and we commit ourselves to change. We're going to be reading the children's picture book, America Will Be Great. America will be great when all people feel safe, no matter the color of their skin, no matter where they were born, no matter who they love, and no matter where they do or do not worship. America will be great when every person has a safe place to sleep at night and enough food to eat each day. America will be great when every person can go to the doctor and get the medicine and care they need when they are sick. America will be great when all people can get the education they need to do the work they love. America will be great when acceptance, understanding, and love are the expectation for handling disagreements or differences. America will be great when we value all people more than money or power. America will be great when we see ability, value, and worth in all people. America will be great when we welcome those from other places, recognizing that we have much to learn from each other and the possibility of creating a bright future together. America will be great when we value every person's work and pay enough money for people to be able to meet all of their needs. America will be great when we value peace and love equally for all people in all the world. America will be great when we care about the planet and work to keep our lands, water, air, and habitats clean and safe for all that live there. America will be great when we, the people, unite to make it so.
I wrote this song from the tired perspective of policing that we've got to somehow get rid of. So stick with me, it gets better toward the end, okay? When I came to work today, I didn't know how things would stray. My job takes a lot of nerve. I'm here to protect and serve. I'm dressed up in basic blue. I'm paid to keep my eye on you. The common thugs I watch real close. Those neighborhoods we patrol the most. George Floyd may have been unarmed, but many others he may have harmed. Our tactics may have you alarmed, but it's necessary force. I use my judgment every day on who should pass and who should play. If I think you've done some wrong, you'll regret the meaning of this song. You're not out in this all day. If you were, you see things my way. They deserve it anyway. When they resist, it makes my day. George Floyd may have been unarmed, but many others he may have harmed. Our tactics may leave you quite alarmed, but it's necessary force. A large black man is a well-known threat. He's probably in the public debt. I put my knee down on his neck and hold him to protect and serve. I hear his cries of I can't breathe, wipe perspiration on my sleeve. Hundreds of pounds will hold him down. It's how we must police this town. No, George Floyd was clearly unarmed. It doesn't matter who he may have harmed. He couldn't move, so he couldn't resist. The handcuffs were already on his wrist. I overpowered him and held him tight, long after he had stopped his fight. All to protect and serve.
Indiana Jones is perhaps an unexpected starting place for a reflection like this, so please bear with me. I confess to absolutely loving the movies as a child. I mean, the music itself, just by itself, the music is incredible, and who can resist just a little bit of Harrison Ford's charisma? Not to mention all the memes of him punching Nazis. I mean, that is the best, right? And I really wish that this was the whole of it. But in the movies, we also get a glimpse of a worldview that has shaped and ruled the world for hundreds of years. And while I'd love to ruminate on one of Indiana's more adorable catchphrases, like snakes, why did it have to be snakes? The one that really applies here is it belongs in a museum. In Indiana Jones's case, it's easy to root for the least terrible white guy, right? I mean, Indiana really just wants to protect priceless artifacts from the Nazis, right? The Nazis, private collectors, and occasionally evil cultists. all of the movie's bad guys have motives that are obviously repugnant. They set a pretty low bar for liking Indiana Jones. And then we have Indiana himself, who doesn't even want to profit off of the looting of cultural and historical relics. He just wants to preserve them. What could be wrong with that, right? But when I watch these films now, and I did rewatch Temple of Doom while I was preparing this sermon, what really stands out to me is, one, how invisible non-European cultures and people are, and two, how ubiquitous the assumption that white people have a legitimate claim to own and preserve what belongs to others and to accumulate power and profit at the expense of others really is. It's so ingrained that it hides in plain sight. It's also startling to recognize that the descendants of the folks who created those now priceless artifacts, they exist now only as backdrops. They make up the crowds of people that become Indiana's audience for some wisecrack or audacious feat. They're the laborers who toil under some hot sun, carrying luggage or excavating sites. They're helpless victims who are grateful recipients of Indiana's help. Generally speaking, they aren't viewed as the experts of their own culture and history. Generally speaking, there's not any consideration given as to why their communities have been reduced to being, usually at best, the servants of foreigners. If we're asked to notice them at all, it's usually to watch them suffer a violent death. And their deaths aren't even meaningful in the films because their lives are not really part of the story. Their deaths mainly serve to provide a sense of gravity to the stakes at hand and to draw attention to the risks that the white heroes are taking on their noble quest. Perhaps you've already guessed where this is going and why Indiana Jones is relevant to the nightly news. History has a lot to tell us, and movies can remind us about why racism is so intractable in our society and culture. Historical traumas, they span across centuries and generations, but the history of colonial expansion is often taught and told like an Indiana Jones movie, with the Europeans in the spotlight. White heroics absolve the white conscience, because these versions of the events inevitably demonstrate that the colonizers, they just had the best interests of the colonized in mind. In these stories, colonization is not ruthless exploitation. It's economic development. It's not military occupation and state-sanctioned violence. It's benevolent order. And it is not looting. It is historical preservation. After all, it belongs in a museum most likely financed and run by wealthy, powerful, and white people, to be consumed by mainly white people. The United States began as a colony, and we typically get the Indiana Jones treatment to that history. But there are at least two versions of this story. The popular story focuses on the aspirations and ideals of freedom and democracy, and of heroic sacrifice to cast off the yoke of tyranny. For the colonizers, the so-called New World was an experience that represented religious and political freedom, the hard work and wonder of exploration, and the risks and rewards of opening up economic markets. But notice who is left out of that assessment. Who is it that is made invisible by this narrative, like the masses of commoners who crowd the market while everyone is really staring at Indiana Jones? Because there's another story here. For the colonized, the arrival of European explorers brought with it the experience of brutal genocides, cruel enslavement and forced labor, displacement, disease, endless war, and death. And that story has not yet come to an end. In my experience of life in the United States, the focus is usually on lofty aspirations and ideals, and that focus often obscures and diminishes the brutality suffered by those who actually paid the price of colonization. And because people, especially people with relative privilege and power, and so especially for white people, we're socialized to identify with those heroic aspirations, so that even talking about the brutality can be perceived as a threat to us and our way of life. Because the aspirations are worth defending, we become defensive. And that is terribly tragic and ironic, because they make people who are denouncing injustice into enemies, instead of understanding that injustice itself is the obstacle to these aspirations. We can look at policing in the United States through this lens. And perhaps I should pause to note that we can and we should look at all of our institutions through this lens. Policing is not unique in this regard. All of our institutions have been influenced by these competing stories and by white supremacy. In the case of policing, the popular narrative you're familiar with is that policing is about protecting innocent people. It's about sacrifices that law enforcement officers make in order to create safer communities. Those officers are public servants who are willing to risk their lives so that our lives are not at risk. This ideal version of policing inspires a lot of people to become police officers in an effort to help their communities. And it inspires a lot of communities to glorify law enforcement officers. This is the story that white culture tells and retells. And these law enforcement officers are the so-called good apples that shouldn't be tossed out when we discover a Derek Chauvin in their midst. But who and what is made invisible by this version of the story? In the United States, the history of policing is a complicated tale that often boils down to protecting property and controlling labor. In the North, labor movements threatened the power and profit of the rich, and policing developed out of attempts to break strikes, destroy unions, and control labor. Dr. Gary Potter has described the relationship of police with labor in two distinct forms. First, he says forced dispersal of demonstrating workers, usually through the use of extreme violence. And second, public order arrest, where labor movements were deprived of their power through the arrests of supporters for trivial public order offenses. Often, he wrote, quote, police made use of ambiguous vagrancy laws to arrest both union-organized and unemployed workers. Further, race and property have been intimately connected throughout U.S. history. For example, white people were authorized to capture black people who were suspected of being escaped slaves. And over time, slave patrols and night watches would become the predecessors of police in the South. These dynamics can be traced through time in their connection to slavery, Jim Crow laws, and mass incarceration, and can also be seen in the establishment of police forces to control indigenous populations. This was the case just up the interstate in St. Louis, Missouri. Dr. Terrell Carter described this process in Police on a Pedestal, Responsible Policing and the Culture of Worship. When white settlers moved to the territory, he wrote, they lived in fear of attack from Native Americans who did not, understandably, right, want their land or resources unjustly taken from them. So they formed a group that would eventually become the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department, but was in part explicitly created to, quote, protect white settlers from the retaliatory actions of Native Americans who previously occupied the land. Dr. Carter went on to say that after slavery ended, whites, especially those in the South, were not happy that African Americans had been granted their freedom. They could not imagine a world where African Americans were considered equal to them and living under their own direction. So after the Civil War and into Reconstruction, whites started militia groups whose primary purposes were to hunt down freedmen and runaway slaves and return them back to their former slave owners or sell them to corporations where they would be forced into backbreaking physical labor. Many of these militia groups served as the predecessors to our modern police departments. Knowing this kind of history, knowing the history of policing, can help us understand how it has evolved and adapted over time. And we can trace that history through convict leasing all the way to mass incarceration today. Indeed, today's prison industrial complex is a massive tangle of institutions and stakeholders, including private corporations that rake in billions, literally billions of dollars, that come from building new prisons, staffing those prisons, and filling up beds. As a prison policy initiative points out, this requires public and private employees, healthcare, construction, interest payments, food, utilities. It also requires judicial and legal costs, civil asset forfeiture, bail fees, and a host of commissary and communications costs. The initiative has documented that mass incarceration by itself, at a minimum, is a $182 billion a year industry. And it especially preys upon the very poor, especially women and people of color. But there's more at stake than that $182 billion. Our socioeconomic and political systems have evolved to facilitate and protect the process of accumulating power and wealth. Throughout our history, and including today, exploitation of human lives in order to amass wealth has been legally protected, and the wealthy have called upon the police to enforce those unjust laws. These laws are not in the interest of our personal or social well-being. We know that inequality is dangerous and harmful. We have the historical record, the psychosocial data, and the personal experience to back it up. But inequality and injustice is legal, and it is afforded the protection of the law. It's crucial that we remember this economic context, this profit motive, when we talk about racial justice and ending police brutality. Now that public interest and support of Black Lives Matter and racial justice issues are growing again, many corporations are beginning to tentatively do the same. A recent example was Amazon.com, which posted a banner on social media and on their main website that expressed Black Lives Matter. Amazon stands in solidarity with the Black community. Jeff Bezos even went out of his way to defend this support when the company received the predictable onslaught of racist tirades and criticisms. So let me say, first of all, thank you for that, Jeff Bezos. I don't want to dismiss the importance of these kinds of gestures in normalizing racial justice. But second of all, we can't ignore the fact that Amazon.com cannot sincerely support Black Lives Matter while simultaneously exploiting Black workers. Amazon's warehouse conditions, for example, are notoriously terrible. And an AP analysis found that more than 60% of warehouse and delivery workers in most cities were people of color, while only about 8% of its managers in the United States are Black. A global pandemic and a resurgent movement to demand racial justice, that could have been the perfect opportunity to address some of those disparities and redistribute wealth. Instead, Jeff Bezos has continued to accumulate wealth and power absolutely beyond belief. An analysis of 2020's first quarter, quote, the company's earnings increased by $33 million every hour of the first quarter, even as its warehouses suffered coronavirus outbreaks and workers walked out over unsafe conditions. Bezos, the world's richest man, has accumulated an additional $25 billion since the beginning of this year, putting him on track to become the first ever trillionaire, end quote. I hope the point is clear. Putting up a banner on a website, that's free. That's easy, right? And in light of the pandemic profiteering of Jeff Bezos, it's hard for me not to see that action, though, as anything but a publicity stunt. To be fair, Amazon.com isn't the only corporation profiting in this way. A recent report by the Institute for Policy Studies revealed that, quote, between January 1st, 2020 and April 10th, 2020, 34 of the nation's wealthiest 170 billionaires saw their wealth increase by tens of millions of dollars. 8 have seen their net worth surge by over $1 billion. Between March 18th and April 10th, over 22 million people lost their jobs as the unemployment rate surged toward 15%. Over the same 3 weeks, U.S. billionaire wealth increased by $282 billion, an almost 10% gain. And this isn't a new trend. The report goes on, quote, billionaire wealth rebounded quickly after the 2008 financial crisis. Between 2010 and 20, U.S. billionaire wealth increased 80.6%, more than 5 times the median wealth increase for U.S. households. Between 1990 and 2020, U.S. billionaire wealth soared 1,130%. an increase more than 200 times greater than the 5.37% growth of U.S. median wealth. Measured as a percentage of their wealth, the tax obligations of America's billionaires decreased 79% between 1980 and 2018, end quote. This is the system that the laws are designed and that the police have vowed to protect. It is 100% legal to make billions of dollars during a pandemic, during which the moral bankruptcy and fundamental racism of this economic system has been on full display. Billionaires in the midst of a pandemic have been literally making a killing, sucking up wealth while real live human beings suffer and die. Again, that is the system that the laws are designed and that the police have vowed to protect. It is considered good business to siphon off billions of dollars that could be invested into creating and maintaining the medical and social infrastructure that saves lives during, for example, a pandemic. It is legal, but it is also cruel and immoral and racist. But wait, there's more. Generally speaking, the very wealthy and their corporations support the system of policing that has produced the very police brutality that is being protested these days. It's well established that police departments receive a disproportionate amount of local funding, usually in the range of 20 to 45% of municipal budgets. But our ever increasingly militarized and high-tech police departments demand even more. This is where police foundations come into play. Those municipal budgets are public documents, and they can be reviewed and criticized by elected officials and engaged community members. Police foundations, on the other hand, usually operate without this kind of oversight. Since public money is not being spent, donations such as specialized equipment are made directly to the police departments. Armstrong and Seidman have given some poignant examples. To quote them, they say, "The Houston Police Foundation has an entire page on its website showcasing the equipment it purchased for the police department, including SWAT equipment, LRAD sound equipment, and dogs for the K-9 unit. The Philadelphia Police Foundation purchased long guns, drones, and ballistic helmets. The Atlanta Police Foundation helped fund a major surveillance network of over 12,000 cameras. In Los Angeles, the police used foundation funding to purchase controversial surveillance software from Palantir. If the LAPD purchased this technology through the public budget, it would have been required to hold public meetings and gain approval from the city council. By having the foundation purchase it for them, the LAPD was able to bypass this oversight. They go on to say that these foundations provide a public-private structure wherein the corporate elite can overtly support police departments through direct donations, sponsorships, and special programs, and by serving as directors on foundations' boards. The ongoing protests have emphasized that police exist to enforce a racist social order that protects corporations, capital, and buildings rather than black and brown lives. Police foundations are a key space for orchestrating, normalizing, and celebrating the collaboration between corporate power and the police," end quote. This has to be emphasized. These wealthy, powerful corporations are willing to spend millions and millions of dollars each year to increase very dangerous and disturbing trends such as the militarization of police forces and the ever-expanding invasion of privacy through surveillance and big data. What these wealthy, powerful corporations are not willing to do is pay fair wages, offer just benefits, and redistribute wealth in an equitable and sustainable way. The wealthy benefit from a set of systems that requires that most human beings experience some level of exploitation, and that has historically and presently ruthlessly and systematically exploited Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. The wealthy and their corporations have an economic and political interest in defending these systems, and so they go out of their way to pour money into things such as police foundations that avoid public accountability and the promotion of the common good. In the end, this is an essential reason why police brutality is tolerated so willingly, defended so passionately, and even protected as a right. Policing connects with our nation's deep and problematic history of oppression, especially as it's related to race and wealth. Its roots are in the attempt of those in power to defend land that had been stolen from native peoples and labor stolen through exploitation, including slavery in the South and sweatshops in the North. Economic systems have played a crucial role in producing a version of policing that protects the power and wealth that was and is accumulated through exploitation and injustice. As Dr. Cooper put it, quote, "From the beginning, American policing has been intimately tied not to the problem of crime, but to exigencies and demands of the American political economy. From the anti-immigrant bashings of early police forces to the strike breaking of the later 1800s to the massive corruption of the early 20th century through professionalism, tailorization, and now attempts at amelioration through community policing, the role of the police in the United States has been defined by economics and politics, not crime or crime control." He went on to say, "As we look to the 21st century, it now appears likely that a new emphasis on science and technology, particularly related to citizen surveillance, a new wave of militarization reflected in the spread of SWAT teams and other paramilitary squads, and a new emphasis on community pacification through community policing are all destined to replay the failures of history as the policies of the future," end quote. So, as long as white wealth matters more than black lives, there will be financial motivation to tolerate, protect, and even promote police brutality. I feel like I should say that again. As long as white wealth matters more than black lives, there will be a financial motivation to tolerate, protect, and even promote police brutality. There's a lot more to be said, but we can pause the conversation on this point. Our wisdom lesson this morning was a joyful, beautiful vision of what life could be like. None of those aspirations are unattainable, and most would not be very difficult to bring into reality. Yet we struggle. Our unjust systems and cultures and our participation in those systems are obstacles to that vision. White supremacy stands in the way in all its forms, including within our white-centered capitalist economic system. The title for my sermon comes from an article by William C. Anderson called "Forget Looting, Capitalism is the Real Robbery." He wrote that, quote, "In a nation that has never gotten past the Civil War, it fought over a wealthy class not giving up slavery profits. Defending the wealthy is a tradition. The same people who created and currently benefit from the current crisis are intentionally mismanaging plenty of other parts of our existence. The robbery we should concern ourselves with is the theft perpetrated by a system that creates desperation, where people in need have to go and take for themselves what should be a guaranteed right. Capitalism encourages thievery from the top down," end quote. We don't have any excuses. We have a vision of how life could be, and we understand how harmful the present systems actually are. In the case of economics, thievery from the top down doesn't work and will never work if what we are working for is a just, compassionate, wise society. Let's demand better. And that means we have to be willing to dismantle and divest from economic injustice. We have to ask ourselves and our communities and our leaders if Black lives matter more than the financial perks and profits that we access, especially if we are white. Because if we are to reach a sustainable and life-giving future, we have to make sure these oppressive systems come to an end. They don't belong in the future. We must dismantle them now in the present. But they should not be forgotten. We want to remember and continue to learn how to grow into justice and love. So maybe Indiana Jones can help us just a little bit here after all. Let's lay these oppressive systems to rest because they belong in the past. They belong in a museum.
This is a song by Randy Newman about a terrible person. It's called It's Money That I Love. mountains, and I don't love the sea. And I don't love Jesus, he ain't done nothing for me. I ain't pretty like my sister, or smart like my dad, or good like my mama. It's money that I love. It's money that I love. They say that money can't buy love in this world, but it'll get you half a pound of cocaine and a 16-year-old girl and a great big limousine on a hot September night. Now that may not be love, but it is all right. It's money that I love. 3, 4, it's money that I love. Used to worry about the poor, but I don't worry anymore. Used to worry about the black man. Now I don't worry about the black man. It's money that I love. It's money that I love. It's money that I love. It's money that I love.
It's June, and Roger often asks me to speak on my experience as a genderqueer, bisexual, demisexual, and generally queer person as part of our recognition of and support for Pride Month. But the pandemic and then the resurgent awareness of and actions to insist that Black Lives Matter have necessarily been on the front of our minds. So let me just say today, the first Pride was a riot. And the insistence of mainly trans women of color that the world acknowledge their humanity, dignity, and worth in the face of oppression. The LGBTQIA+ communities have, by and large, happily thrown ourselves this month into supporting Black Lives Matter, as well as protesting the disparities blatantly displayed during the pandemic. And is there really any better way to celebrate Pride Month? So, assert your humanity, support gay rights, demand the arrest of the cops that killed Breonna Taylor, and go in peace to love and to serve.